A man is condemned to death, and as he's dragged from the courtroom, he locks eyes with somebody in the watching crowd. I heard that women once ruled Asia, he shouts, but this is something new, a eunuch as king. And with that, he's hauled off to his execution. His name was Orxines, and he was one of the many Persian noblemen to come unstuck at the hands of Alexander the Great. But I think that Orxines' story is unique, and in this video, I'm going to tell you why. If your country was defeated in battle, what would you do? Would you look to continue the military resistance and risk death? Or would you look to work with the invader and protect yourself and your family? That was the choice facing Persian noblemen in this period. Now, what's fascinating about Orxines is that he's somebody who seems to have tried to work with the Macedonians, but to have failed. His downfall gives us an insight into court politics in the reign of Alexander the Great, the challenges facing Persian noblemen in this period, and what happens when two cultures clash. And there's some mad stuff about eunuchs as well. Throughout his invasion of the Persian Empire, but especially after the pivotal Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Alexander gave Persian noblemen jobs. He was essentially saying, hey guys, look, if you defect, if you come and work for me, there are opportunities for you. What he was trying to do here was fragment the Persian elite and prevent Darius III, the Persian king, from continuing the military struggle. Alexander had been in Persia in 331 and 330, but he'd moved on to Bactria and to India. But by 324, he was back in Persia, and that's when this incident involving Orxines took place. Arrian, who's one of our main sources for Alexander, says that as the Macedonians were approaching Persia in 324, they discovered that the guy Alexander had appointed to run this region had died. Orxines had decided he was the right person to keep things ticking over. We'll come back to why that matters in a minute, but the key point is just that Orxines seems to have been running Persia for Alexander. But that was about to change. Let's get to what happened. This is the tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae in Persia. He had founded the Persian Empire in the 6th century, and his importance was acknowledged not just by the Persians, but by Macedonians and Greeks as well. Now, when Alexander reached Pasargadae, he discovered that Cyrus's tomb had been robbed. We actually know a fair bit about this because one of Arrian's main sources was a guy called Aristobulus, and Aristobulus apparently was the man put in charge of restoring Cyrus's tomb after this robbery. I won't go into that here, but the juicy detail is that the priests who guarded Cyrus's tomb were apparently tortured for information about who was responsible. They revealed nothing. But Alexander didn't need to wait too long to find out what had happened. When he got to Persepolis, the Persians started to make a range of accusations against Orxines. He was found guilty of robbing tombs and temples and of executing Persians unfairly. And so Alexander had him hanged. I'll explain how historians have interpreted this account in a second, but before we get to that, there is another story, and it's much more scandalous. Our other source is a Roman historian called Quintus Curtius Rufus, or Curtius for short. Now, I should say right at the start that he calls the figure that we're talking about in this video Orxines rather than Orxines. I do always put links to the ancient sources that I've been drawing on in my videos in the video description. So I just wanted to mention that difference in case you guys wanted to go away and look this up for yourself and wondered what was happening. Honestly, it's nothing to worry about. These kind of little differences are the kinds of things that happen when we have different ancient authors taking Persian names and translating them into Greek or Latin. Anyway, Curtius says that Orxines welcomed the Macedonians into Pasargadae with a lavish ceremony, and as part of this he gave really valuable gifts to Alexander and his leading courtiers. Horses, jewellery, chariots, gold, silver, furniture, whatever it is, whatever you can name, Orxines was giving it away. But one person was left out. Bagoas or Bagoas. Curtius claims he was a Persian eunuch who had had a sexual relationship with Darius III and had been passed on to Alexander. He was furious not to get a gift from Orxines, and so he set out to destroy the man who had slighted him so publicly. There is loads of debate about Bagoas. Some historians in the 20th century refused to accept that Alexander could have had a sexual relationship with a man, so denied that Bagoas ever existed. Now, I don't want to get distracted by that here. It's a fantastic story. If you'd like a video on Bagoas, let me know in the comments and I'll do one in the future. What matters for now is that Curtius claims that the relationship between Alexander and Bagoas was sexual, that Alexander was infatuated with Bagoas, that this gave Bagoas the ear of the king, and he used this to poison Alexander against Orxines. Alexander supposedly had Cyrus's tomb opened up so he could pay his respects, but he was surprised that there were not lots of luxurious, valuable items there. Bagoas was straight in his ear saying, "Oh, this used to be full of money. There was loads of valuable stuff in there. I bet that's where Orxines got those gifts he gave you from. He robbed them and he needs to be punished." Alexander was quickly persuaded that Orxines should be executed, and it's in Curtius's account that we get that brilliant line about a eunuch as a king that I opened the video with. So Arrian and Curtius portray this event in very different ways. For Curtius, this is an injustice. Orxines has been brought down by a scheming eunuch. But for Arrian, Alexander is implementing justice for the Persian people who have been wronged by Orxines. So which account is right? So I'm actually a little bit nervous about this part of the video because I'm going to give you a sneak preview of some new research that I've got coming out, hopefully later this year, I think, in a book called The Intersectional Alexander. Now, intersectionality essentially means thinking about how different aspects of our identity overlap or intersect and affect the way we experience the world. So we're talking here about things like race or gender or class or sexuality, all of those kinds of things. Now, the editor of the book asked me to think about sexuality and class in the reign of Alexander, and doing that really helped me see this story that Curtius tells about Orxines in a new way. It really struck me how far Curtius goes to emphasize the different status of the two men. In his account, he has Orxines call Bagoas a scrotum, a whore, and he uses this word over and over again. This is obviously highly sexual language, but it's also a way of demeaning Bagoas and stressing his civility. And Curtius pushes that point even further by emphasizing that he was a eunuch, which also probably meant that he was an enslaved person. Orxines, meanwhile, is introduced as a descendant of Cyrus the Great, which emphasizes his nobility. He's then described as a man of supreme distinction, and by the time he's hauled away for execution, he has become the most noble of all of the Persians. What Curtius is doing here is using class to manipulate the way readers respond to this story. Curtius's Roman readers were all part of an imperial elite, so they would naturally have felt some affinity with Orxines, a fellow nobleman, so the way that he is characterized by Curtius creates sympathy for him. It also made this tale a warning about the dangers of allowing favourites into royal courts, because they could use their personal relationships with a monarch to destroy members of the nobility who otherwise deserved better. Now, this tale might be set at the court of Alexander the Great, but this messaging gave it a real-world value at the time when Curtius was writing within the Roman Empire. These moralizing qualities of Curtius's account make me prefer Arrian's version. So how should we interpret that? Most historians would agree that Arrian's account is more reliable, but they tend to interpret it by setting it alongside the removal of other people from Alexander's administration. Ernst Badian, for example, talked about Alexander instituting a reign of terror when he returned from India. For him, Orxines was a threat to Alexander, so the charge of robbing Cyrus's tomb was just to pretend to get rid of him. Brian Bosworth also sees these charges as a smokescreen. You might remember that earlier on I explained that in Arrian's account, Orxines takes power in Persia after the previous governor had died while Alexander was in India. Bosworth argues that Orxines had essentially taken power without Alexander's permission, and this amounted to usurpation. So in his view, Alexander saw Orxines as a rebel, and that's why he had him punished. But I think that there's a deeper story here. Arrian and Curtius emphasise that Orxines was a loyal, faithful servant for Alexander. Arrian stresses that Orxines only took power to keep order for Alexander while the Macedonians were in India. And we should remember that communicating with Alexander at this point would have been really, really challenging. It would have taken months for messages to go from Persia to India, and people in Persia would not have known exactly where Alexander was at any given moment. I think that fact gets overlooked by historians sometimes because we're often focused on Alexander's own intentions. It makes me wonder, what would Orxines have thought about all of this? Of course, we don't have an account from him, but what we do have is a really interesting parallel which helps us unlock this. Much earlier in Alexander's campaign, while the fighting was still going on, there was a general on the Persian side called Memnon. He fell ill during a siege at a city called Mytilene, and we're told by Arrian that on his deathbed he appointed a guy called Pharnabazus to be his successor as the commander of Mytilene until Darius III could deal with the issue. This gives us a precedent for a local commander making a really important political appointment and then asking the king to ratify this when he was able to. And there are parallels here. When Mytilene was under siege, it would have been really hard for local commanders to communicate with Darius III, just as it was really hard to communicate with Alexander when he was in India. So while Alexander might have interpreted Orxines taking power as a challenge to his authority, Orxines might actually have just been following the usual Persian practice for dealing with an emergency when communicating with the king was difficult. And I think this opens up an even bigger question about how Alexander handled the administration of his empire. The Persian administration had evolved over 2 centuries, but because the empire was so big, the king quite simply couldn't be involved in every decision. He had to delegate really significant levels of authority to his local governors. Alexander will have understood this, obviously, but it's also true that he grew up in a kingdom that was much smaller and where the king could be much more directly involved in settling local issues. So I wonder if he expected to be making more of the key decisions himself, rather than just ratifying choices made by his local governors. So what we might have here is a clash of expectations about how an empire should be run. What I find fascinating about Orxines is that his case takes up just a handful of pages in the ancient sources, but it unlocks so many massive issues. By getting beyond Alexander's perspective on events and thinking a little bit about how Orxines might have felt about all of this, I was able to get to what I think is a really big, really important point about attitudes towards imperial administration. That emphasizes that it's really important for historians to look at everybody in our sources and not just focus on the big names. If that's something that you're interested in, go away after this and watch my video on Apama that I'll put a link to in a second. Orxines also reminds us that it isn't just what happened that matters for historians, but how events are reported. Curtius's account might not be true, but it helps us appreciate that Roman authors were using Alexander as a vehicle to explore the challenges that they were facing in their own lives. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you might enjoy my video on how World War II transformed the way scholars thought about Alexander. So if you want to go away and do history yourself, I think there are 2 lessons from this video for you. First of all, make sure to explore events from the perspective of everybody who was involved. Secondly, all of our sources reveal something. So don't just think, oh, that source isn't true, let's move on, let's forget about it. Think about what the source is useful for, and you'll be able to find value in it. So I hope that's useful. If it is, if you've enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, please do subscribe to the channel. I'll be back next week with another deep dive into ancient history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you then.